Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining me, Simon Lash, as I check out the top 10 unforgotten facts about the War of 1812, presented by 10 Facts. So I'll be facts checking the facts presented by 10 Facts on the 10 forgotten facts about the War of 1812. Why am I doing this? Well, I've got a fascination about the War of 1812. I've been sort of learning about it and studying it since 2013, and I visited the sites in Niagara and the Chesapeake. So I've got a real sort of flair and passion for it. And as I was going through some YouTube videos, because I'm going back there this year, I thought I'd just refresh, I'll read my books again, etc., etc. And I've just found that some of the YouTube videos weren't quite telling the truth, or could have explained it a little bit better. So that's all I'm doing in this video, is just looking at what they say and then say whether or not, yeah, that's true what they're saying, and maybe if I can just elevate it slightly with what actually happened, or just give a little bit of another fact about their fact that they're talking about. So join me now. Let's dive in. Before we start, I just want to say that I'm going to do this in one take. There's going to be no cuts or anything like that. So I either know the fact, or if I don't know the fact, I'll say I don't know, and we'll just carry on with it. And I'll just say whatever kind of comes into my head as we go on. And it's nothing to just point things at people and say I know more than you or anything like that. It's just, if we're going to put stuff on YouTube and say they're facts and etc., etc., then we've got to make sure that they actually are facts. And I hope and pray that they are. All right, so let's dive in and take our look on the 10 unforgotten facts about the War of 1812 by 10 Facts.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today, the top 10 forgotten facts about the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the first real major declared war in independent American history.
Okay, I've made my first muck up there. I didn't put my headphones on, so I'm going to do that now. I was going to keep it rolling because I want you to see that, you know, I'm not going to keep cutting in and out. Right, everything adjusted. I should be back okay now.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching Top 10's Net, and in the video today, the top 10 forgotten facts about the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the first real major declared war in independent American history, and really brought the country to its knees due to mostly its own doing. But today it is hardly talked about or remembered in American history at all, the way that many other wars are. What is remembered and regularly told tends to be the stuff of legend and has a ring of untruth to it. The truth is that Americans tend to largely forget, or at least only tell the good bits about the War of 1812, because it was largely an embarrassment to the United States and a...
Okay, I'm just going to go back slightly. It was the first declared war, but I think America did go to war before that, or war was declared on them by the Barbary, which were made up of sort of Tripoli, Morocco, sort of North Africa, kind of bordering onto the Middle East kind of country. So there was the Barbary Wars, 1801 to 1805, something like that. In fact, you may have to do a fact check on me, but there was a war before that the new independent America was involved with. Although war actually wasn't declared by America, it was declared by Tripoli or the Barbaries.
A truly unforced error. Number 10. The British temporarily took Washington and burned down the White House. Some people have heard that the British temporarily took Washington, D.C. during the war and even burned down the White House, but it was a bit more complicated than many know from the brief summary that appears in many history books. Most imagine that Washington, D.C. was the place of some kind of bloody battle, but the truth is that it was largely undefended and pretty much taken without a fight.
Okay. So I wouldn't say that, because there was a Battle of Bladensburg that was just before, or it's the same day that we marched onto Washington DC. So I wouldn't say it was largely uncontested because we lost a lot of people there. Not relative to like World War II or World War One, but at that time, and we lost a lot of our commanding officers during that battle. So yeah, although yes, it was uncontested, the Bladensburg races occurred after that, whereabouts the militia capitulated very quickly. But Commodore Barney took a great stand there and did a lot of damage to some of our troops, and we did a lot of damage to ourselves, particularly with Thornton taking his light infantry across, or trying to cross the bridge at Bladensburg too quick. But there was a fight, and we did lose some people at the Battle of Bladensburg.
When the war started, the United States hadn't had a truly hardened army for some time, as they had been trying to stay out of international affairs and hadn't had any problem with anyone until the British started impressing their seamen. The United States militia was weak and disorganized and simply not ready, so the fledgling United States military took up positions elsewhere, and DC was eagerly conquered. The White House, the Capitol, the naval headquarters and treasury, as well as many other government buildings, were burned to the ground. However, the reality is
I don't know the definition of burnt to the ground, but they didn't quite burn to the ground. Yes, the innards were burnt quite a lot, but the Capitol, the White House as we know it now, or the presidential mansion as it was known then, didn't burn to the ground. The structure stayed up. And going back to the naval dockyards, it was the US that burnt their own dockyards. They scuttled it, and they'd rather it didn't fall into the British hands and give them the pleasure of burning it. So most of the damage to the dockyard was already done by the time we got there. And General Ross, who was the commander of the land forces at the time, actually was ordered to burn everything, just burn everything you can. And he didn't. He kind of disobeyed that order and only stuck to public buildings. And the reason that kind of happened was because when he entered Washington under a flag of truce, under a parley, as they call it, to try and come to some terms about the surrender of Washington, he was fired upon, which was a big no-no. If you come under a sort of flag of truce, you don't fire upon them. You allow them entry and you negotiate. And that infuriated him because he was going to build no burnings. He didn't want to, and so some historians say it was because he was fired upon. He was under a lot of pressure from Cochrane, who was the commander of the forces at the time, or the naval forces, etc., etc. So actually, they could have done a lot more destruction within the city.
The British occupation lasted for only about 24 hours, as they felt they needed to continue on and move in order to avoid counterattacks and keep taking territory. Unfortunately for the British, as an invading force, they simply did not have enough backup forces regularly supplying them to keep up such sustained conquering, and while at first they won battles due to their discipline and training, sheer numbers and resources quickly wore them down. Their only real hope at winning such a war that quickly would have been to capture the government leaders, and even their rushed attack on the United States Capitol was not fast enough or sneaky enough to achieve that goal.
I'll tell you what's really interesting there is that President Madison was actually at the Battle of Bladensburg, and he was actually the first president to be on the battlefield at the time of battle. There's only been one since, which was Abraham Lincoln, I believe, during the Civil War, but as Commander-in-Chief, it was their right to do so, and Madison was actually at the Battle of Bladensburg and only started to retreat or left when it became that the British were going to start to break the lines, and it was going to be a British victory. So, yeah, and the accounts on the British side say if they just had their cavalry there, they would have caught Madison. They would have been able to do that. So, yeah, I mean, overall though, for that first sort of fact, or second one, yeah, it's true. We went into Washington. We burnt some public buildings etc. But the Americans also did that. They burnt their own dockyards. We didn't do that. And in fact, the day after, there was a huge explosion on the dockyards that killed, I think, probably one of the biggest single death tolls that we had. About 40-something soldiers and sailors were killed in that explosion in the dockyard. So.
Number 9. It started with the British conscripting US Navy soldiers and creating new resentment. One thing Americans do tend to know about the War of 1812 is that the British were stealing their seamen, and that was the main reason why they got into the war in the first place. They did it because it was an unspeakable outrage that Americans simply wouldn't take lying down. This was despite the fact that Great Britain at the time was a far greater power, and America had basically no navy or standing army that would compare. Many people, however, are short on the details here. The truth is that impressment had been a legal practice of the British Empire, legal under their own laws, for hundreds of years. Impressment was a practice wherein if the nation was at war and adult men were found idle or otherwise not working in ship-related occupations, they could be pressed forcibly into naval service. This method was also allowed to be used on British citizens on board foreign ships, and the British Navy bullied the United States by using this shaky legality to kidnap a lot of United States sailors. After several thousands, although the exact number is constantly called into question, the country decided it had had enough and declared war, kicking off an ugly conflict against a much more powerful country.
Okay, so that is one of the reasons why the United States went to war. And there's three other sort of main reasons. I'm not going to go too much into detail in them, but there was the Orders of Council, which was basically about trade and trade embargoes, etc., on goods coming to Europe. And then there was the fact that the British still had a foothold over North America because it owned Canada. You know, we ruled Canada at the time, and the Americans didn't like us on their northern border. They wanted us out off North America. And then, of course, there was the support to the Native Americans. We were really supporting the Native Americans, providing them with arms, and politically supporting them that they should have their own lands and that the United States should not encroach on their territories, which were to the west, mainly of the states that were around in 1812. So, yeah, there's more than just that reason. So it's a part fact, but we'll see what else comes on. But that's not the main reason for war.
Number 8. The United States destroyed the Parliament at York. Part of the untold story of the War of 1812 is that the United States took the opportunity during the declared war to attempt to take a bunch of portions of British-controlled Canada, and they failed spectacularly in the process. However, while attempting to take control of Canada, the Americans did win some hard-fought battles, and their actions caused a lot of not-so-great consequences in the near future. After winning a battle at York in Upper Canada, at the location now known as Toronto, the Americans, well, they went a little overboard. After taking the town, their losses were great, and they were feeling pretty keyed up, so they decided to take it out on the town, as well as its people. They looted York, burned down the Parliament building, and a whole lot of government and other buildings as well. People talk about the burning down of the White House with outrage to this day, but it was actually a retaliatory arson for the attacks in York. While tit for tat is something people can never claim to be a proper moral stance, it is actually clear in the historical record who started it in this particular situation.
Yeah, it was retaliation. There's no simple way about that. It wasn't just York, though. I think that there was other towns. Dover, I think, was another town, but there were a number of buildings that the Americans were burning and stealing goods from and robbing goods from. And you know, Washington wasn't the only place we did that. We raided up and down the Chesapeake in the United States, and we did a lot of raiding during 1813 and 1814. So we did do probably more raiding than what the Americans did. Yeah.
Number 7. The story of the painting of George Washington leaves out a lot of details. One of the few famous legends of the war that even most who know little about the War of 1812 have heard is of how the First Lady at the time, Dolly Madison, smuggled the original full-length portrait of George Washington out of the White House in her dress, escaping as the British were closing in and burning everything down around her. The truth is that she had plenty of time to escape and saw them coming in more than enough time, although the right road to escape through might have closed off if she had waited too much longer. More to the point though, the popular story of the painting itself leaves a lot to be desired. To begin with, the heroics to rescue the painting were not performed by First Lady Dolly Madison herself, rather by a servant, an enslaved youth named Phil Jennings, who was instructed to either get the painting out safely or burn it in order to avoid it getting into the hands of the British and being desecrated or held hostage by them. The slave had to break the frame itself and then roll up the portrait in order to get the huge piece of art safe and out of harm's way. Now, it turns out that not only was a slave the real hero in this story, but it is actually one of several copies of the original Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, and many of these were not even painted by Gilbert Stuart. Number 6. Native.
So, Dolly Madison did tell her servants and staff to save stuff. Whether it was Jennings or not, I still think that that's a bit of a... There was a number of staff that were at the time that she told to save stuff. Whether he did that alone, I imagine he was part of it, but there was a few of them that basically did it. And they took some other stuff as well. But what's more commonly known is that more stuff was looted out of the White House by Americans than was done by the British. So those people that stayed behind in Washington looted, and there's a reported story that Madison, as he left, because he went back to the White House on his way back from Bladensburg, told people to take what they want and save what they want from the White House. So yeah, Dolly Madison did tell her servants to take as much stuff as they could to retreat, with one of them being the painting, which now actually I believe is in the East Wing of the White House and is next to a full-length portrait of George Washington's wife. There's a top 10 fact for you.
Americans played a big role on the side of the British. Going back to the American Revolution, the natives had fought with the British in the hopes that the British winners would keep their promises to help the natives keep the West free of further American expansion. The truth is that the natives had good reason to believe this, as British laws had slowed the taking of native lands back when the colonies were still under British rule. At the time of the War of 1812, the British believed arming the natives could help defend Canada from the Americans, and so they gave them loads of supplies. The natives were mostly formed into a confederacy under the leadership of a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh, who was skilled at politics, battle, as well as military strategy. Unfortunately, during the Battle of the Thames near what is now modern-day Ontario, the coalition of natives suffered a great defeat at the hands of the Americans, and Tecumseh was lost in the battle. The death of their leader led to the end of the fragile coalition of tribes and warriors, and an end to the dream of Native Americans stopping the westward expansion. To make matters worse for the natives, the one real win for America in the War of 1812 was that after its conclusion, the British decided to stop arming the Native Americans or helping them in any way, as long as the Americans left Canada alone.
Yeah, that's probably like not our finest hour. We had many, but again, yeah, we did. We withdrew the what's going on there?
Number 5. Apart from
we withdrew our support to the Native Americans after, or as much support as what we had before, because we were just tired, and Europe was, still not right, and we had a large empire to I want to say protect, to maintain, I think, at the time. So yeah, it's a shame what happened to the Native Americans during that war, and particularly after.
Pressment, the United States was more the aggressor at first. While the Kingdom of Great Britain did start the hostilities in the first place by very unethically kidnapping American citizens and forcing them into naval service, they were not the first to actually declare war or...
I just have to clarify that in that we wouldn't have taken... If they didn't have papers that showed that they were American, then we would take them. This is what the literature I've kind of been reading. But there was a kind of, if you've served with the American Navy, you automatically become an American citizen. So it's a bit of a to and fro on that one. It's not quite as plain as what's being said here.
Start actual physical hostilities or invasion attempts in this particular conflict. In point of fact, the British were far too busy with the Napoleonic War, which was the reason they were impressing American seamen to begin with. For this reason, they stayed mostly low-key at first. In fact, the first major attempts by either force to take anything significant were the United States' failed attempts to take British-controlled North America, what is now Canada. However, this does not mean the British were entirely innocent of provocation beyond the impressment itself. While their major attacks and blockades would only get going as the Napoleonic War was wrapping up, we do know that they did supply Native Americans with money and intel in order to further a proxy war against the Americans from a distance. This hindering of America's westward expansion helped fuel American anger and helped the Americans forget their sense of reason long enough to declare war against a much greater power.
Yeah, I've read that, what's on the screen there. I don't know why I'm pointing it, you can't see. It mentions nothing about impressment. It just mentions about naval forces going to war. But yet the first real action was trying to take Canada. Hence why I say the real reason for war was not what he said about impressment at the start of the war. It was a factor, yes. The French were doing it. The French were also blockading, but they didn't go to war with them. They wanted us out. They wanted us out of North America, and they wanted to expand their territories. That's why they went to war. I think that's no dispute on that.
Number 4. In Great Britain, the War of 1812 was just another theatre in the Napoleonic War. To Americans and many people in Canada, the War of 1812 was a truly significant war in its own right. The British, of course, they saw things very differently. They were in an all-out war with Napoleon, who was trying to make France the conqueror of the world, and at this time he was pushing through Europe and ambitiously trying to take Russia as well. The British, they felt it was simply their right to impress as needed for the overall conflict, and they felt that the United States declaring war on them when they were involved against such an ambitiously out-of-control general was more of a stab in the back rather than anything else. They also had very little resources to spare, so to them the war at the time was really nothing more than a distraction. Indeed, at the start of the war, the British tried to negotiate their way out of it. One of the justifications for the war had been that Britain had been blocking neutral trade between America and France, and they even considered partially rescinding this in order to avoid war, but President James Madison made the impressment of American seamen a sticking point, and the British were not willing to cave on that issue.
Okay, I don't know if it's going to go on to it, but I'm going to stop there because there was a lot of information. So, firstly, we did repeal the Orders in Council. Lord Liverpool, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, he became Prime Minister in actually 1812. There was an Act of Parliament read on June about the 16th, I want to say, which then was voted upon, which repealed the Orders in Council because they were doing huge damage to the British war efforts in the Peninsular War. The United States were sending food, etc., that was destined for the Peninsular Wars. And then it had to come to Britain first, get checked, get boarded, pay a tax, give some of its levy over, etc., and this was putting real pressure down on the British soldiers fighting in the Peninsular War. So there was there was other factors as well to do with trade and trades in the UK, but they were repealed on the 16th of June 1812. But news didn't get to Madison until I think, August of 1812. But because it wasn't the main factor for war, they wanted land. They wanted the British out of North America. Otherwise, they could have done it, because if they didn't have the Orders in Council, they couldn't board the boat. So how could they know that they had American or British sailors or American sailors on board? It's a bit of a, yeah.
The British spent a very small amount of their forces at first, mostly sticking to defending Canada with the few troops they already had, and supplying Native American forces whenever possible. It was only after Napoleon was greatly weakened that the blockade of the USA went into fuller force, and the British really started attacking America in return. It didn't take long after the full force of the British Army and Navy were brought to bear that the United States found it in their hearts to negotiate an end to the hostilities.
So during 1813, we mainly blockaded on the American East Coast, which was damaging America greatly. Their merchant vessels were attacked and was really affecting their economy, particularly from New England all the way down to sort of Virginia. And then, of course, on the northern borders, we had a small force out there. But in 1814, we had defeated Napoleon, and the Peninsular War ended. And that's when General Ross and his men were moved over to America. About 4,500 soldiers were sent to that region. There was a larger force under General Hill, but he went to Canada. And so there was about 20,000 in total given, but it was found that the Americans' main army advances were on the border with Canada, which really demonstrated that taking Canada was their priority. So we sent more reinforcements to the Canadian border, and then also it's easier to drive in and supply on land than it is from sea. So an invasion force would have come from Canada. So, but exactly that. It was after the war with France had ended in sort of mid 1814, April 1814.
Number 3. The 1812 Overture has absolutely no connection to this war whatsoever. The 1812 Overture is one of the most familiar pieces of music in the United States, and in a way it fits the country very well. It is brash, bold, and full of rockets and cannon fire, taking up essentially the whole ensemble an orchestra can bring to bear. It also has 1812 right there in the title, so most Americans assume that it is a chiefly American song about their own victories, and it's played to celebrate their independence. However, the Overture was actually written by Tchaikovsky and has absolutely nothing to do with America. It did indeed have to do with the war, and indeed this war was fought in 1812, but as we mentioned in the previous entry, the American War of 1812 was just another theatre in the globe-spanning Napoleonic Wars. And of course, these wars also included the Russians. The song was actually written to celebrate the Russians' ultimate victory against the French, starting slower as the Russians were not doing so well in the overall conflict at first, and building to a dramatic crescendo as they finally forced the retreat of the invading European forces. The Boston Pops used it back in 1984 for a 4th of July celebration, not in order to confuse people, but simply because they thought the style was particularly fitting. It was so popular that the Boston Pops plays the song every year at their celebration, and the misconception continues in the minds of many Americans to this very day. Number 2. The War of 1812 almost bankrupted the US government.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything to say on that fact. It's a fact that the 1812 Overture had nothing to do with the United States War of 1812.
And only ended from exhaustion. The War of 1812 is not very well taught in America today, so many people are under the impression that it was a really big win for the United States of America. However, with the Treaty of Ghent, the two powers agreed in 1814 to officially end the war status quo ante bellum, or the status before the war. What this means, in essence, is that the boundaries stay the same, no one gains or loses any territory, and no one really cedes any major financial or other reparations. The United States spent millions, lost thousands, and failed entirely to gain any traction in Lower or Upper Canada. They did not gain anything in a war that they essentially started. Now, some might argue that the United States did need to start the war in order to stick up for themselves, but declaring war and trying to protect yourself navally is quite a bit removed from going several steps further and invading British-held Canada. The truth is that the United States attacked too hard and too fast. They bit off more than they could chew, and with the costs of the war as well as the British naval blockade, they were quickly going bankrupt. The only reason Britain agreed to end the war was because the British people were simply war-weary after the Napoleonic conflict and wanted to go back to normal trade relations with the New World. The Americans also saw no reason to continue. With the Napoleonic conflict over and no seamen being impressed, there was really nothing left to fight about.
Yeah, all of that is true. The Americans were on the verge of bankruptcy. The president had to keep asking Congress for more money because he needed to he needed to fund the army and the militia, and particularly paying the militia and building arms and stores. And the impact on trade that had happened over the years, it's like California not giving any money to the United States now, because that's a sort of trade impact that New England had on New England, who was probably the largest single contributor at that time to the US sort of Federal Reserve, to the US Federal Bank and the taxpayers' money. And of course, the revenue wasn't coming in because goods weren't being sold, and the cost of war was very expensive, and it was bankrupting America. And it was only because the British didn't have the appetite, exactly as I said there. We were tired of war. We didn't want to be at war anymore. And even Wellington, was getting involved, saying, look, we shouldn't be sending troops over to America. We should be concentrating in Europe, securing Europe. That's our main theatre of war. Which, of course, he was right, because, of course, in 1815, the Battle of Waterloo happened when Napoleon returned. But if we had just held out, a little bit longer, it may be different, because America would probably have gone bankrupt.
Number 1. Much has been forgotten about the true story of the Star-Spangled Banner. The story of the Star-Spangled Banner, in many Americans' eyes, is the perfect story of hope and of inspiration. As far as many people know, Francis Scott Key was captured by the British and stood by, trapped on their ship, scribbling furiously into a notepad to...
He wasn't captured. He was there to release Dr. Beans, who was caught after the Battle of Bladensburg. There's a whole other story on that I won't go into now. I'm sure it's Dr. Beans. Let's see where this goes. He wasn't entrapped.
To show his belligerence and defiance to the British, proudly declaring that despite the horrifying fireworks show going on, that Americans' persistence and the flag would remain throughout the night. However, the story is actually a little bit more complicated. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer, and quite a good one at that, so he was actually up to his usual business that night. A friend had recently been arrested by the British, and he had gone to board a British vessel in order to see if he could secure his release. He was so good in negotiating that the British actually released his friends, but Key and his pal heard word of the coming attack on Baltimore, so the British could not simply just let them leave for the time being.
Like I said, I probably got too ahead of myself there. Yeah, Dr. Beans was the guy, and Dr. Beans was not arrested. He on the march towards Bladensburg, he opened his doors to General Ross let his men stay on his land, and said that he's on his side and would do no harm to them. But on the retreat back, when we were coming out of Washington, we went back the path we came, just slightly different, but back through Upper Marlborough. We had stragglers, and Dr. Beans and a group of people, I can't remember all their names at the moment, started taking these and holding them as prisoner. And when Ross found out about this, he said, "Go get our guys back." Did Ross find out? Anyway, when he got news that Dr. Beans had been holding these people and not living up to his word, and Ross really believed in that sort of, if you say something, if you hold to your bond, you stick to it, and the rules of war, etc., etc. And he ordered the arrest of Beans, so they went and got him, and because he was really unhappy about that. And actually, Francis Scott Key had dinner next to Ross on the ship. I think it was the Tonnant. Was it the Surprise? I can't quite remember that, so I can't call that a fact. But there are accounts in some of my books whereabouts Francis Scott Key at dinner at night prior to the landing at North Point of the attack on Baltimore, sat close to or next to Ross, General Ross.
They allowed them back on their own boat with a small guard just to make sure they didn't run off and warn anyone. Francis Scott Key had a front row seat to watch the entire attack, but like the British, that didn't necessarily mean he always had the greatest view. While you don't really hear people sing it with the inflection of a question, he was actually terribly worried that the flag had gone down at certain points and that America had lost. The famous verses are actually him questioning his own eyes as to whether the American flag, and not the Union Jack, was still soaring over Fort McHenry. Not only that, but there are 3 other verses that are never sung at baseball games which revel in the final victory and gloat angrily about the British final failed attack on the fort. And it's probably best that these verses remain mostly unsung. So I really hope you enjoy.
So yeah, it's true. It wasn't called Star Spangled Banner at the time. It was called The Bombardment of Fort McHenry. Something like that was the name of the poem that he actually wrote, not Star Spangled Banner. It has 4 verses to it, as he says. It's probably a bit like the British anthem that has like 4 or 5 verses, but we only ever sing the first verse. But the third verse, I think it's the third verse, does only very mildly talk about slavery in a sort of context about them. Well, I can't quite remember, so I'm not going to go into it. But that's probably why he says they're probably best not sung. But yeah, it was actually called, I want to say, The Bombardment of Fort McHenry. I think that's what it was called. Was the actual title of the poem, and it was actually put to a British drinking song, or a British song called Anacreon in Heaven. Anacreon in Heaven. I can never pronounce it. It's a really weird word. And that's the actual tune that it's played to. So the two are mashed together and become the American anthem. But it didn't actually become the American anthem, though, until 1931, I want to say, around there. Someone, in the comments below, let me know if I'm right or wrong. But yeah, 1931. So yeah, Francis Scott Key, and I've been to see it actually. I went to Baltimore, and if you ever go to Baltimore, you've got to go to Fort McHenry. It's still there today. It's still standing because we didn't destroy it, and it's a fantastic museum.
Enjoyed that video, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos every day.
Okay, so that seems to be it. No, I think overall it's, for 10 facts about the War of 1812, I wouldn't necessarily say they're unforgotten facts. I think they're probably some of the most thingy facts, but that's coming from me, someone that studies it, etc., etc. So the only thing I would say is, they kind of got there about why the war started, but it was just a bit iggly-piggly. And I don't know if it's the references they're using, because they brought up a lot of references on there from internet searches and stuff like that. I try to stay away from them. I look at them for a big picture, not specific detail, because I go to try and find primary sources, because there are a lot of primary sources, and of course secondary sources through books, etc., etc. that I've got on my shelf up there. But yeah, I try and stick to them and not too much on the old internet searches, because there are lots of, it doesn't matter what you read, there's lots of biases. But overall, I do think, that 10 facts did get, the facts are correct in what it's saying. All of them things did happen. Just maybe a little bit of rounding out and finesse on the actual detail would have been great. So yeah, let me know what you thought of this. This is the first one I've done. If you've got any videos you'd like me to look at on the War of 1812, where it's people have said stuff you think may or may not be true, then put it in the comments and I'll take a look. If you send a link or tell me what the video is called, I'll go take a look. So thanks very much for joining me, and all I can say for now is Lash out.